Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along to see this talk. I'm Katie Fenn. I'm from Sheffield, just down the road. I work for NPM. I don't work in the Bay Area. I work in Sheffield at home. What else was I going to say? Yeah, I'm a front-end developer. Do a bit of JavaScript and do a bit of public speaking every now and again. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about writing modular style sheets using a new tool called CSS Modules. Before I start, there's a quick content warning, just in case animation on big screens makes you feel sick or uncomfortable. Content warning will appear in the bottom right-hand corner of my screen on the slide before that animation appears. And also, if you need access to the links and to the slides, there's a URL in the bottom left-hand corner that will stay on screen throughout. That you can go to find those notes and helpful links. So here's another person talking about yet another tool. I can imagine the question that's going through your mind is, why do we need another tool? We have Less, we have Sass, we have Post CSS. Why do we need CSS modules? Well, you might have heard about this thing called the global scope in CSS. And what this means is that all the styles from your style sheets inhabit the same global environment. That means that one rule can freely overwrite another rule's styles, regardless of where it is in your code and who wrote it. This means that just like rubbish that's released from a country in Europe can have catastrophic consequences for islands in the Pacific, so the same problem exists for your CSS. One rule can completely change the styles from another rule elsewhere in your codebase. This makes our sites brittle and vulnerable to change. Sharing code between teams or between companies, between developers is not a trivial task. You have to understand how the CSS works before you can use it. You have to understand the markup that you need to apply that CSS to before you can start sharing code. And you can start to become scared to jump into CSS to make a change, because you might change a rule and you might change something completely unrelated to what you wanted to change on your website. So you pause before actually jumping in and changing something. And developers are trying to build more and more complex websites using reusable components that can be copied and combined like flat pack furniture. The idea is that if you build interfaces out of components like headings, like form fields, like buttons, if you need to make a new feature, a new page, then you can just compose that page out of these components that you can just bolt together very quickly and save time. Things like atomic design and design systems really propose building websites like this. If we have a look at this website, this website was built by developers who wanted to create reusable components. If we have a look at the navigation for this, we can see they have very common styles between the navigation elements in the header and the different categories on this website. If you wanted to create a new page that has these kinds of lists, then you can just reuse these styles. However, the same fundamental problem of this global scope has not disappeared, the global state. Our site's growing complexity, yet CSS is just as fragile as it ever was. Meanwhile, we discovered that the benefits of modular JavaScript with tools like Node.JS, like WebPack, helped us build more complicated websites. And it turns out that JavaScript developers also face the same problem of a shared global scope, that JavaScript could overwrite and change JavaScript anywhere else on the website. So JavaScript developers' tools such as WebPack and Node.js and CommonJS, Require.js to make JavaScript work locally by default, to make JavaScript work in safe little rock pools instead of the ocean of global scope. So that's what CSS Modules aims to do for CSS, to change it to make CSS work locally by default, make it safer to use. And CSS Modules is not one single tool. It's a format that's been developed by a community of developers and a series of plugins that work for different tools that implement that format. So how do you write a CSS module? We pretty much write it just like this. It looks just like CSS. It's been designed to maximize the compatibility with all of your existing tools. So it is pretty much just normal CSS, except it's local by default. Your style sheets are processed by a CSS Modules plugin that works a little bit like a preprocessor like Sass or Less. So you have a source file and it's read in by the plugin, and you get a processed file at the other end. Now this processed file has changed slightly. It's changed your CSS. What it's done is it's transformed the class name to make it unique. It's appended a unique hash onto the end of your class name. And this unique hash is generated from the class name and the directory path that the file that class was used in. This means that two classes used in different files can't clash with each other anymore, even if they have the same class name. It's not unlike the block element modifier ideology. Block element modifier makes class names more unique by prepending more context onto the class name. But instead of having to think about naming conventions for blocks and elements, the CSS Modules plugin does all that hard work for you. So if you need a class for a button, you can just name it button. If you need a class for an input element, you can just name it input. Sometimes you want to write global style. Sometimes you want to set properties such as setting the global font, setting colors on text, and font size and things like that. And to do this, you can just use the global keyword, and that makes your CSS behave just like normal. When it's processed by the CSS Modules plugin, the same thing gets spat out the other side, it just ignores it. That means that you can write normal global CSS if you want to. Plugins also create map files in JSON format so that you can map those localized, unique class names back to their original. So if you wrote input in your source file, then you can use this map file to get the unique class in your templates, and you can load those in. This is in JSON format, so you can use it in practically any scripting language, PHP, Node.JS, Ruby on Rails, or Python if you want to. When you, so for example, if you wanted to load a CSS module into a Node.js or JavaScript application, then you can load the CSS module, and that passes that map file JSON in so that you can inject the unique class names into your templates. CSS Modules also allows you to compose rules to reduce code repetition. So here I have a class called input, and it has some shared styles that it shares with other components. So I've extracted that out and I just put composes in here. And when that gets read in by the CSS Modules plugin, it means that the composing class, the thing that I am composing the class out of, is injected into the template anywhere where this composing class is used.
No.
Do you want front end?
Leeds front end. People meetup? No.
No, sorry. So this is a little bit like using the Sass extends keyword, if you've used that before, except this is immune to some of the code bloating problems that is associated with Sass. Because Sass has to make lots of different rules for all the combinations of the classes that are being composed together, this works in a slightly different way. So it injects those classes into the template, and it's immune to those kind of code bloat issues. You can also compose classes together. You can compose global classes. So for instance, if you're creating a website using a global tachyons style sheet, you can compose classes together using those global classes. So if I wanted to apply the padding style, a margin style, a black color style from tachyons, and I wanted it to be applied to where I use the input class, that will allow me to compose that from a global style sheet. CSS modules will also load relative file paths inside the URL property. So this will apply a hash to the class name, which means that you can use it with your build tool chain, so that you can keep your nice readable local file name inside your style sheets. And on your production site, it will show the hashed, cache busted full URL, which is really, really helpful to keep your CSS nice and readable. So yeah, we can see that it's cache busting that URL, and it's looking inside your assets folder as well. So how do you start using CSS modules? Let's talk about some of the plugins that you can start using. If you're using WebPack to create JavaScript applications, the CSS Loader plugin that's used by quite a few different applications can support this straight out of the box. And that's the URL for it there. Post-CSS is a CSS preprocessor that's really similar to Sass and less. Instead of redefining a new language to create your style sheets out of, it's configurable using plugins. So you can add a plugin to Post-CSS to add nested rules. You can add a plugin to add mix-ins. You can add a plugin to add variables. And CSS modules is just one of these that you can add. And my favorite thing about that, about Post-CSS, is it can be used in PHP applications. It can be used with Django and Python and Ruby on Rails. It needn't be a JavaScript web application. So I've created a really quick demo to show you how you can use this, how you can start using CSS modules. So this is a really simple web form that's based on CSS modules, written in PHP, I think, and using Post-CSS. I've created reusable components, one for the input boxes and one for the button as well. So if I wanted to create a new form, a different form, then I can just bolt these things together and create a new form. So let's say I wanted to change the border style for the text boxes and want to make it much thicker, sorry. If I just make that change to my CSS and run gulp, run my build tools, we can see that the border style is changed on those input boxes. So far, so straightforward. Let's take a look at the CSS for the button component. We can see that it's also using a class called input, which is also used in the CSS for the input box. Now, normally, if I changed the CSS on this class, then it would overwrite the properties for all other elements that are using the input class, but that's not the case. If I change the border style to something different on this, and run my build step again, we can see that the changes are applied just to the button component. And the reason this is because CSS Modules has made those class names unique. That's pretty much all it does. It just adds that hash to the class name so that you can reuse them. So let's say I wanted to set some styles globally. I've got an element called page that wraps around my entire application, and it's not using CSS modules. It just has a normal class name of page. If I add the global identifier onto my rule here and change the styles of this and rerun my tooling, then it will just work like normal CSS. I've also extracted styles that are common to both the input box and the button to a separate composed class called shared. So the width of these elements, the font size, and the border radius are all the same in both these components and this component. So I've extracted them to reduce code repetition. If I decide to change the style of this shared class that's used by both, say increase the font size, then it will increase the font size in both of them. We can see that this is done by adding the shared class name anywhere that is being composed by, and that's injected by CSS modules into your templates. Sorry, the text size is a bit small. If you go on to here, then you'll be able to see all my slides, and you'll be able to see this in much bigger text. I do apologize for the size. So you can try it yourself. There's a demo project, this demo, on my GitHub profile. That link is on that page there at the bottom of my slides if you want to try it out. It's written in PHP, so it should be fairly straightforward to get working. If it's not, please tweet me and I'll see if I can explain this a little bit on Twitter. So there's a few quirks in using CSS modules that it doesn't quite work exactly how normal CSS works. CSS modules won't let you use local classes from different files. If you're used to using normal CSS, then you'll be used to reusing class names from different files in child selectors. You can't do that in CSS modules with class names from different files. At first, I found that to be quite a jarring experience because I was so used to doing that. But after a little while, I think I realized that it wasn't so bad because I'd been using the block element modifier quite a lot. The block element modifier naming convention quite a lot in my CSS. And that encourages you to start using longer, more unique class names in your CSS that might just have only one class in any given element. And if you're already doing that, it makes it much easier to move your CSS over to something like CSS modules. Also, only ID and class selectors can be transformed. Type, attribute, pseudo selectors are not affected. They just pass straight through unaltered by CSS modules. Also, only class and ID selectors can be used in composition. Because composition works by injecting class names into your templates. If it doesn't have an attribute to inject them into, such as when you're using a type selector, then it won't be able to work. So you can only compose using ID and class selectors. So what are the benefits? Because your CSS can be as modular as the rest of your code, your style sheets aren't like a blueprint that you keep completely separate to your templates anymore. You can keep your style sheets right next to your templates and keep them in the same folder. And this is very different from when I started out doing CSS and front-end work. We used to think of this idea of separation of concerns where we have HTML in one place, we had JavaScript in another place, and we had CSS somewhere completely separate. But I think what I discovered is that your CSS for your component has more more in common with the HTML that it's being applied to. So having a directory structure where you keep your style sheets very, very close to your templates really makes sense. And if you wanted to extract your components and build an open source library, put them into NPM to make them modular so that the rest of your organization can reuse the components that you're working with, then you're able to take those directories, those folders, and put them straight into GitHub or into NPM. It makes them easier to extract and share. Styles from different modules also cannot overwrite each other. Because they're made unique, it means that you can reuse classes such as input, you can reuse classes such as heading. And that means that each team in your organization can use the CSS that's right for them. If you have a team working on your homepage and they want to use heading, then your checkout team can also use the class heading, and their CSS isn't going to clash with each other. It also means that specificity is more manageable. If you've ever found yourself writing longer and longer and longer selectors, trying to one-up the specificity of another class, of another rule, it makes this, it doesn't make specificity go away, it just reduces the problem to a much, much smaller scale, makes it easier to manage. Also, sharing code is easier. Your homepage can make components that your homepage team can make components that your checkout team can reuse. And because your components encapsulate the CSS that they use, your other team doesn't need to know how your CSS works. It doesn't need to know which elements you need to put together to apply that CSS to, because you share the component together, you share the template, and you share the CSS together. So modular CSS is a really, really big trend. There are quite a few different projects that are exploring this idea. Tools such as Radium and Aphrodite allow you to write modules of CSS in JavaScript. So instead of writing CSS code, you're writing JavaScript code. That actually makes more sense than it sounds, more sense than it really seems if you are not writing JavaScript. But for JavaScript applications, it actually has it works kind of weirdly well. So those are available for writing CSS and JS style sheets. Styled components is made by the creators of CSS modules as their kind of take on their CSS and JS. And it uses some, if you've used ECMAScript 6 JavaScript with all the new features, then it uses some of those features as well to make it nice and neat. Also, there's Stylable, which is a new project by Wix, who make the website that allows you to make your own websites. That is very, very similar to CSS modules, and it aims to make your CSS as compatible with the rest of your toolchain as much as possible. So this is what it's all about, I think. The core benefit of CSS. So CSS modules allows you to build truly modular user interfaces that's made up of your HTML templates and your CSS together. And that means that your component encapsulates the CSS you need. If you want to share code between two different teams in your organization, the developers don't need to know how that CSS works. And that makes it much easier to share code. If I wanted to boil it down to one piece of advice that a friend gave me, I worked on a project at Skybet with a developer called Glenn Mailer, and he said, try to think of the component as the unit of reuse. Don't reuse individual styles, don't reuse individual pieces of HTML, think of the whole component together. And encapsulate those styles so that you don't need to know how they work if you're going to share them. So that is pretty much the end of my talk. As I said at the beginning, I work for a company called NPM. I have a lot of stickers if you want to take them and put them on your laptops, and not just NPM stickers, I've got tons of others as well, so please come and pinch some. Also, you might be aware of a conference in Sheffield called Front End North that's happening next week. It's at Sheffield City Hall. I think it's on Friday the 19th of January. If you wanted to go along to this event, you can pop in Katie Fenn, just one word, into their registration form, and that will give you a discount on a ticket if you want to go. Also, there's something happening next month called the Global Diversity CFP Day. This is a workshop that's being run in many cities around the world, and it is a workshop for people who are underrepresented in conference speaking, to get them to encourage them to send applications into conferences to get more and more people speaking at conferences who are traditionally underrepresented. I want to run one of these events in Leeds at Skybet, just down the road. So if you're interested in getting up and speaking, about talking to people about something new and cool, then this could be for you. And you can find the details at that URL up in the corner. If you follow me on Twitter, you should be able to find everything about this. So I'm Katie_Fenn on Twitter, and just about all the details should be on this URL here. So thank you very much. That's where my slides are at, and that's what I am on Twitter. Thank you.